Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for this episode of the Crexi Podcast, an insider's look at all things commercial real estate. In this show, we cover a broad range of topics that cater to CRE newcomers and industry leaders alike. I'm your host, Jessica LaRusso, Regional Director of Sales, and today we are thrilled to sit down with Daniel Dart, General Partner at Rockyard Ventures. A little bit about our guest. Daniel Dart is the founder of solo GP fund Rockyard Ventures. His journey from homelessness and incarceration to where he is today shows how powerful second chances can be. A leader and advocate for underserved and underprivileged communities, he has worked on the ground, helping build equity and social movements on both a local and global scale. A rare talent, he matriculated to the London School of Economics graduate school without ever having received an undergraduate degree. In addition to being published in Harvard Business Review and the World Economic Forum, he has presented his academic and economic research worldwide, including in Sri Lanka, China, Ireland, Japan, and the United States. Daniel's journey to where he is today is anything but typical. He was born in the Bay Area, but spent most of his youth in Southern California. He experienced homelessness on the streets of San Diego and Los Angeles between 1999 to 2001, a chapter of time that shapes everything he does today. Daniel was also the brainchild of a prominent punk rock band, Time Again, where he wrote and sang about social issues, poverty, and getting through life one day at a time. In 2011, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison, where he filed and won an appeal to reduce his sentence by 2 years. Upon release, with a new perspective of owning his flaws while being true to himself, he made amends and launched the second chapter of his life, one that focuses on the altruistic value of helping others. He recently completed his executive MBA at MIT, where he is the first formerly incarcerated student in the school's history and a recipient of the Dean's Fellowship, Sloan Leadership Fellowship, and the Pichasek Fellowship Award and Scholarships. He is an active member of Milken Institute Young Leaders Circle, an advisory board member of Village Capital, and a fellow of the Salzburg Global Forum. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
How's it going, man? That's a pretty good bio stitch there. I'm always like, wow, man. A friend of mine was like, we need to snazzy this up and make it sound better, because I was like, yeah, we do cool shit.
You've done a lot.
So yeah, no, it's great to be here. I've been busy. Yeah, I'm doing a lot, and yeah, and I also got a lot of other stuff happening too, which is really
Awesome.
exciting.
Well, I'm
I'm
super
pretty
excited to
fortunate
get
there.
into it. I know we just covered your amazing story, but I'd love to hear from you directly, kind of take us through it in your own words. So can you share some of the most important parts of your journey and really how they all link together to get you where you're at today?
Yeah. I'll do my best to kind of keep it quick. So, as it said, born and raised in California, all across it. Super tumultuous upbringing, which I kind of think later on became a superpower, because I was raised kind of outside of the normative kind of social structures. So a lot of system living, where it's detentions or reform schools or homelessness, which for a long time I think was really difficult. As I've gotten older and kind of broken into more, I would say, traditional spaces, it's been helpful because I don't look at things the same way that other people do. Like, there's a lot of times, like, I don't really know the rules. So when I do things a certain way, I think a lot of times it's like, hey, if everybody stands on a line, they don't realize sometimes what the line is. And so for me, I'm able to color outside of them a little bit easier. Ended up, when I was 22, starting a band, really as kind of a joke. Like, it wasn't anything serious. I didn't really think it would work out. Called Time Again. 6 months later, we had a record deal. A few months after that, we were on tour. Ended up, touring the
Wow.
world a few dozen times, and getting gold records. And it was fucking nuts, to be honest. It was wild. Then things kind of came to a screeching halt. Around 30, I ended up getting arrested. Ended up getting sent to prison. Thought for a while I was going to do life in prison. I was fortunate, got overturned, and got out. But then I got out 4 years later with kind of nothing. I had to rebuild my life over. and ended up getting into like social organizing, again, kind of accidentally. My first job out is I was a maid and I
Wow.
changed sheets at Airbnbs. And then I ran into one of the guys
Oh, get
from
out.
Weezer, actually, and ended up, yeah, doing some work for Brian Bell at Weezer, and kind of got into management and was working with Weezer and Santana and Seal and all these people. And from there, got into the social aspect. Um, and that led to me with some opportunities with the Obama administration, which opened some doors with like the World Bank and the UN, which led to working overseas. And once I got overseas, in 2017, I started to learn about venture, but it was weird through the lens of big kind of international
Hmm.
development and infrastructure projects. So the name of my firm is Rockyard Ventures. That's actually based on like a building materials
Oh,
supplies company that my dad ran. And so when I was a kid, we called it the
love
Rockyard,
that.
right? Like, oh, where's dad? Like he's at the Rockyard. That wasn't the official name. Um, but as I got overseas and was working on these kind of development projects, I kind of intuitively understood a lot
Hmm.
about the construction process and development because I had grown up around it. And certain things that I think when you're within it,
Hmm.
you kind of take for granted just how project processes go. And as I started working more on that and looking at new technologies and started investing, you know, my VC fund is like what I call kind of the
Hmm.
extension of the family business, you know? So it's like they kind of do construction from a different angle, and I kind of do it from the
That's
technology and business side.
amazing. Let's get into a little bit more about how you've pivoted so many times, right? And
A lot of pivots. Yeah. It feels, it's weird. I think from the
yeah,
outside, there's a lot of pivots, but like having lived it, it
it
actually
all makes
feels like
sense,
very much
right?
a straight line, you know? It feels very, very linear because I'm like, oh, I want to do this, let me do that. And so, yeah,
Hmm.
it's like once you kind of connect it and you see how it works, it's almost like a Quentin Tarantino movie. You kind of flash back,
It all
and then
makes
at the end, you're
sense.
like,
I
oh,
love
this all
that.
makes sense. I
Walk
get
us
it.
through like what really catalyzed the change from, serving out your sentence to the decision to want to pursue an MBA at MIT.
Yeah, so once I got overseas, and it's weird. So like when I identify with different communities or different that, once I started working overseas with the UN Refugee Agency and those type of organizations, I really identified with the plight of a refugee, of someone that kind of like I moved so much growing up and I was in so many places that I feel had a personal connection to the situation
Hmm.
of kind of feeling like a feather in the wind. Um, so as I kind of got more invested in that, the question was really like, how do we build some type of, I would say, more sustainable
Hmm.
infrastructure, and that comes with capital. And so a lot of it was like, hey, how do I build out financing structures for these different communities I'm working with in the Middle East and Africa? And so that got me
Hmm.
interested in economics. And so from there, I started reading about it. I started watching YouTube videos. I eventually learned about Google Scholar, where you can like download free academic papers. And from there, I started reading those, and I was like, I feel like I could write my own academic papers. And so that was kind of the first foray into it. And again, it came from like this weird place tied to like
Hmm.
kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like food, shelter, transportation. And to me, like shelter and having a sustainable home was always
Hmm.
like something that I lacked for a long time. And so that was like the first thing. So when I first got into like prop tech or whatever you want to call it, the idea behind it is if I can make houses 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, then it should
Hmm.
increase by a factor of 100, right? Um, and at the same time, as I was kind of learning econ and doing these papers about different capital flows in emerging markets, I had started doing work with a group called Skid Row Housing Trust at the time, a big multi-billion-dollar nonprofit for affordable and permanent supported housing, because I had also been homeless
Hmm.
on Skid Row for like 2 years. And so now I was kind of learning about these really unique capital stacks overseas, about moving money in and out of countries with really fragile financial systems, and at the same time, like the crazy capital stack
Hmm.
that's necessary to build permanent supportive housing or affordable housing in like San Francisco, where it's like, yo, this is just a total fucking nightmare. And so it was kind of this confluence of
Right.
events kind of happening because working with these organizations in San Francisco and LA, having been homeless, I had a super unique perspective. And then on the other side of having kind of bounced around, so as I learned more about economics and in writing these papers, eventually I started submitting them to academic conferences, and eventually they started getting accepted to say, hey, will you come present your proposal? And at that point I realized it was like really unique for someone to be in an academic conference that didn't have like any
Right.
post-secondary school at all. And I think I was the only one at any of the conferences. And I remember the first time I was like going to present in Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. And you submit the paper blind. So like you submit it and then they send you back a note like, hey, you've been accepted. Like, who are you? And they accepted me and I'm like, oh, like, yeah, this is great. Like super excited. They're like, yeah, well, what school are you from? And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, like what university are you from? I'm like, I don't get it. And they're like, well, where do you teach? And I'm like,
I don't.
I don't teach. They're like, well, where'd you get your degree? And I'm like, what? And it didn't click in. I thought it was just, and they're like, where'd you go to school? And I'm like, LA? Like, I don't know what you're. And then I didn't realize at that point, it kind of goes back to what I had said earlier, like having come from outside the system, to me, it never crossed my mind that like the only people that would submit papers were academics. Like I was like blown away. And then they were like, oh, we've never had someone submit a paper that's not a PhD or something. Like you're the first. And I think that one that just blew me away, but I think people were so like, well, how did you learn it? And I'm like, dude, I took free classes like for edX at Harvard, or like, I just downloaded and took it, and I still now, like even at Rockyard, the people who work for us, like I tell them like, hey, block out some time each week to read, and like actively, what I call active learning, like everyone should be actively learning, where it's not like, oh, I read when it's comfortable, but like investing in learning and knowledge, like compounding the same way you would work out or brush your teeth, like make it a regular habit. And so once that kind of took off, things really started to change, because then I started to get a lot more attention, but then access to people that I had not had access to before. And that's when I thought, oh, where can I really go with this? And a mentor and a friend said, have you ever thought about like going to school? And I was like, yeah, but like, why would I go do an undergrad or a bachelor's? Like, I feel like I've already surpassed it. Like, why don't you just go straight to master's? And I'm like, well, is that even possible? And he's like,
Right.
I don't know. Let's find out, And so then I ended up approaching London School of Economics, which I have immense amounts of pride in, and ended up going there and figured out the way to work. It was the first guy, and ended up actually doing 2 masters simultaneously while I was there. And that was a ton of fun. And then I was thinking about doing a PhD, and there was a guy named Sir Julian Lagrange, and he's awesome. He's been knighted. He's the shit. And I was like, hey man, you should supervise my PhD. And I don't know how old he is, must be 85. And he's like, oh man, I would love to, but he's like, I feel like you're more interested in being a practitioner than a teacher. And I said, well, I don't know. He's like, you should probably look into doing like an MBA. Like you've done 2 research degrees, right? You've done the academic thing. Because the degrees at LSE, it's a very big research institute. So it's like you're really deep in dissertations and academia and papers and that. And so I was like, okay, I'll look into it. And then ended up at
Incredible.
MIT.
Truly.
Yeah, it's been a journey. It's been a journey. It was it's pretty wild sometimes when I say it retroactively, because I'm like so in it sometimes, so heads down, that like when I pop up to look around, I'm like, holy shit, like I
Well,
just
it
did all
takes a
that.
huge
That's
amount
pretty
of
fucking wild.
determination, right? Especially you mentioned like blocking out time to learn on your own. It's not easy to do that and force yourself, on your own time versus when you're only in that academic structure. So,
Yeah.
can you share, some of the maybe qualities you have, skill set that really helped you kind of keep pushing and learn all of these new skills on your own? I'm sure a lot of our listeners want to know kind of some of the day-to-day habits that it takes to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I think I think that probably the biggest one where I'd say like how I just see the world is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like what's your 50-year plan? What's your 10-year plan? And there's a famous saying, I didn't coin it, I wish I did, that people
Mm-hmm.
overestimate what they can do in 1 year, but underestimate what they can do in 10 years. And so I think that we kind of live in this world of immediate gratification, where like we're constantly comparing ourselves to our peers or
Mm-hmm.
our compadres or whatever on like a day to day or a week to week basis. And so the thing that I kind of think of is more of like, how can I be a
Mm-hmm.
tortoise in a world of hares? Like, I think a lot of times thinking like, hey, I probably can't beat you like in the next 6 months, but like, what if I put
Mm-hmm.
10 years of work and effort into that? And what does success look like? And so I kind of have always thought of things like that. Um, and so my approach has kind of been the same, where I'm like, hey, like, do I think I could walk across America like in 10 years? Probably. And so like I look at these really big goals, but then I set realistic kind of timelines. And then I think either I'm really stupid or sometimes I'm really disciplined, but I think there's a level of
Mm-hmm.
competitiveness um, that I bring where I'm like, I definitely have a chip on my
Mm-hmm.
shoulder, like for sure. Where I'm like, yo, man, like I'm just gonna outwork you. And over the next 5 or 10 years, like I feel like I can outlast you. It's like that Rocky quote where he's like, it's not how hard you can
Mm-hmm.
hit, but how hard you can get hit. And like, like I feel like I could take an ass beating. You know what I mean? And like,
Right.
but that's how I'm kind of going at it. And what I've found is like it's really, really, really hard to beat someone who
That's
refuses to give
wonderful
up.
advice. I'd love to know a little bit more because a lot of our listeners today, they might be thinking about starting their own business, right? Or they might be early on their career. Can you walk us through what were the practical steps that you took to found Rockyard, right? And to launch the company and to get
Yeah.
funders on board with your visions. Can you walk us through like how you did it?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things that I would do a lot in the past is I would go onto like LinkedIn and I would like
Mm-hmm.
look at like my dream job and I would look at the qualifications necessary to do that dream job. And then I would make like a step and I'd be like, okay, how can I start to check these off? Right? With the goal that theoretically, if I could check off all those boxes, I would be qualified
Mm-hmm.
for that job. And so like I would try and be process driven instead of outcome driven. And so a lot of times like I would look at those jobs and say like I need these four things. I have these, I don't have these. Or I have these but I don't
Mm-hmm.
have a way to prove that I have them. Right? And so it's almost like Boy Scout badges. Like you got to achieve a certain thing, you get a badge. And so when I would look at that, I would try to figure out that. And
Mm-hmm.
LinkedIn just has it. They'd be like, hey, you want this job? You need to have these. And it was a lot easier to focus
Really
on those
smart.
one small
Mm-hmm.
pieces. Like, hey, I need this. How can I do that? And then from there, what I call my water cooler theory is like
Mm-hmm.
people that were checking off those boxes, like, where are they? And how can I be their friend? Right? Like, how can I be around them? How can I get to know them? How
Mm-hmm.
can I become, as I say, one of the fellas? And so that was kind of the tactical approach. Now, of course, like I want that like dream job or something like that. But what I found is once you start to put
Mm-hmm.
yourself in the middle of these communities and chip off smaller things, then every once in a while it's like a video game, like a turbo pack, and you'll meet somebody and you like leapfrog like 10 steps or something like that. But that was like probably one of my biggest things is like going to LinkedIn early on and being like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
what are the qualifications? Even when I went to LSE, it was like, here's the qualifications you need.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't have that, but what do I have that can theoretically be an equivalency of that? And then how can I create some form of documentation or a reference or something to prove I have that
Smart.
equivalency?
I love it. Very systematized.
Yeah, I say a
Mm-hmm.
lot, systems drive outcomes, right? And so a lot of times, like, how do I build systems? I read something the other day, like, we don't get to choose what we do. Like we get to choose our habits, and then our
Mm-hmm.
habits choose what we do. Um, I think with the reading and active learning, one thing I say is like I'm never I can't always be the smartest guy in the room, but like I can try my best to
Mm-hmm.
be the most informed in the room. So like I can try and like outread you, outstudy you, out prepare you. And so like the compounding effects of that over time um, are big. And then there's the competitive edge. So it's like I want to be the best read of my peers or people I know. And then if I meet someone who's better read than me, like I want to beat
Right.
them too. So like there's those things, but I think like reading, it's really like
Mm-hmm.
a developed habit. So like once I think you get into the rhythm, um, you want to do it more and more because you see it's I think like getting healthy. Like as you get healthy, you feel better, so it's easier to stay healthy. And it's the same thing with reading. Like the more you do it and the more you learn, and that's why I think you have these like
Mm-hmm.
lifelong academics is because now they're just kind of hooked on that, and it kind of gives you a little bit of a superpower. I think most people are are super fucking lazy. Like I don't know, I could pull on the internet like what is the average, how many books
I'm
does the
sure it's
average
not very
person read a
high.
year?
I'm
And it's
sure.
probably low.
Right.
You know, how many books? I'm gonna ask right now.
Should we guess? I'm gonna
You
say like,
know,
oh, I wish I thought it was higher, but I'm gonna say like two or three.
yeah, I think what it says is the average American says they read
There's no
12 a
way.
year, but the truth is the data shows that it's
Okay.
actually fewer than
Oh,
four. So it's like let's say three, right? Um, I, to be honest, I think I would probably
I-
doubt that too, right? Like I think if you went around to your peers and you said, "Hey,
mhm.
how many books have you read?" And I think that like most people, I think people maybe they buy for a year, and I think
Mhm.
just sitting down and doing it, um, and I think you can figure out what works for you. Like maybe just do Audible, or I think the problem with what I see just anecdotally with books and reading is a lot of times people are like, I love nonfiction, and I get that, but no one wants to watch like
Right.
college classes on the internet. Like it's fucking boring. So it's like, yeah, you can read some of that, but like also read, you know, like fiction, read like trash novels. Like it's so rad because the only way I can ever get into your mind is if you write a fiction
Mhm.
book and there's human interactions, I can actually get into your mind because that's the only way I can perceive the way
Mhm.
you view human interactions. So from like an EQ building standpoint, like I can learn so much from fiction. Like right now, I read a lot
Mhm.
of nonfiction, right? I do read a ton, but I also read a ton of not. Like right now, I'm reading like Iron Flame and Fourth Wing, which is like it's like I feel like it's like
It
Twilight or something. Like me and my fiance, we started it on audiobooks when we drove across country. And then when
yeah.
we got there, she's like, "Oh, cool." And I'm like, "Well, I'm
Is it
started. I
in
gotta finish the
is it
series
in
now."
AY
So I'm like,
fantasy
I'm
books?
in
Is
it,
it AY fantasy? Oh yeah,
Um,
those are so
yeah,
addicting.
it's a YA fantasy, but I'm like to me reading is fun, and I think there's so much to be gained rather than just facts. It's just, hey,
Mhm.
how do people treat other people? How do people
Right.
treat this? Or like, and so I think that well-roundedness ability, like technical ability is great, but without EQ and empathy,
Yeah,
it's really
100%. And I'm sorry, I
useless.
meant YA, young adult. I love them too. um,
Yeah,
they are fun.
yeah. But they're just fun, right? And it's like I think Stephen Colbert said the difference between adult novels and YA is
Totally,
people actually read
totally.
YA. That's the only difference.
Well, given all of
Yeah.
your expertise and your knowledge in the sector, I'd love to get a little bit more in the nuts and bolts of our topic today and the particular passion of yours, right? The housing sector and the organization of the world that we live in. So maybe you could kick us off by where did your passion for cities come from? And can you share a little bit more about Rockyard's investment thesis and really how you got to form that?
Yeah. Yeah. So It's so weird. I think I've always kind of grown up liking cities because I love like the industrial kind of like golden age, and I think it probably came from
Mm-hmm.
reading books like Fountainhead and like Atlas Shrugged as a kid, of just like these people building these huge monuments and stuff like that. And then growing up around my dad
Mm-hmm.
and like construction sites and all of those, the kind of ideal adult male role model were these guys, like hardworking, kind
Mm-hmm.
of like, salt of the earth. And so I always really admired that kind of individual,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I think we always say like our first hero is always our parents, right? And I think that that's very true in my
Mm-hmm.
case, right? Like my mom and my dad, both my biggest heroes. And so I think I had this respect for that from a very early age. Later on, as I kind of went through my own life experiences and ups and downs and all of that, I think one of the things that I still think about is like how fucking hard it
Mm-hmm.
is to just like live, right? Like just like from owning a house to property taxes
Mm-hmm.
to renting a home, like so much of the average, I think, American just spends their life worried about
Mm-hmm.
just a roof over their head. And I think that although I understand that, I think it's
Yeah.
kind of fucked, right? I'm just like, yo, like there's got to be a better way to do things. And not only do I think that, I want to be part of that solution, but I think whoever figures out that
Mm-hmm.
solution in scale can make a ton of
Mm-hmm.
money, right? And I think that kind of huge problem set, having been homeless and then worked on the boards of multi-billion dollar developers and stuff like that, trying to solve it, and the red tape, whether if it's like, pre-development, horizontal construction, all of
Mm-hmm.
these different things, policies, like this super, I think, like man-made complexity. Like people, oh, it's super
Mm-hmm.
complex, but like we made it
Right.
complex. Like we wrote those laws. Like we enforced those laws. Like those, like God or the universe
Right.
or a lightning bolt, Zeus didn't just start that. And so, like to me, I think there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
opportunity in simplifying really complex things. And I think whether it's good or bad, like we've made this very, very complex. So a lot of times to build in certain
Mm-hmm.
places that people want to live is really hard. And so um, I've just kind of always been like, hey, I want to go after big,
Mm-hmm.
really big, sticky problems. And I think because most people, again, like reading, I think most people are just lazy as shit, right? Like we have a huge obesity problem in the US, right? Like, yeah, our
Mm-hmm.
food is shitty, but also like if you look at the amount of steps the average person walks a day,
Right.
it's hard. Like, and I get it, gym membership, or like, dude,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need a gym membership. And I think like I'm not trying to say, hey, it's all your fault. Like I understand that systems drive outcomes, but at the same time, like I'm not trying to be
Mm-hmm.
middle lane. I'm trying to be an outlier, right? So like maybe that applies to you. I don't want that applied to me. I want to be the person that steps outside those bounds. And so when I look at the housing crisis or just the building crisis, like the ability to build or the desire to build or
Mm-hmm.
just how incentives are structured, I think there's a lot of misalignment. And
Mm-hmm.
it's super personal to me because I think right now, having been homeless and going from homeless to housed is
Mm-hmm.
so fucking hard. And I think you hear all this, you'll hear some people be like, give them free housing. You'll hear other people say, like, get a fucking job. But it's like, okay, get a job. Well, how do I support
Mm-hmm.
5,000 bucks a month of rent? And what I found is there is no universal truth. And so I think there's a lot of white space for opportunity there. And one, I think I can help a ton of people and make the
Mm-hmm.
world better, I hope. And also make a really great living. That's the goal,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think like, and I don't want to say like impact investing because I don't see myself as an impact investor at all. But like, I look at it like for housing, like
Mm-hmm.
Walmart is a huge company. Really, I think by volume, the
Mm-hmm.
biggest company in the world, right? I think the biggest employer outside Department of Defense. They serve the lowest
Mm-hmm.
income community ever. Like when we think about housing, like, is there a way for us to serve the lowest
Mm-hmm.
income? Like it worked for Walmart, right? And so you look at like Amazon, different clientele, but
Mm-hmm.
also ease of access, great access to low price options. So I think there's also a way to do that in housing and reimagining how housing looks
So I want to
and make a
talk a
ton
little
of
bit
money.
more about that, right? Because when we were prepping for the call, you mentioned that developers previously really were just focused on pushing margins, whereas sounds like you think that future builders are going to be more catering towards like large or mass housing. How's that shift happening? Like what do you think's going on?
Yeah, I think when I said a minute
Mm-hmm.
ago, like incentives aren't really aligned, I think certain times if we look, like say in the Bay Area, like for me to do entitlements or horizontal construction
Mm-hmm.
on a $4 million house, or what I could say is $1 million house,
Mm-hmm.
it the cost is the same. So the hard cost of materials and labor on $1 million house might be two,
Mm-hmm.
300 grand, right? But that entitlement process, so like what they're trying to say is like, hey, there's no reason for me
Mm-hmm.
to make this small house, right? And so I think like a lot of these things need to change. What I know is that there's a lot of people that would be happy with
Mm-hmm.
smaller houses if they're available, right? We just don't have structures in place to make them available. And I think that, it's weird because like we think of America's this free market economy and all this, and I think of like if I go to a nice neighborhood in San Francisco, and I think like Mark Andreessen is like he always says like I'm the free market guy, but then I think he wrote like a letter to his like neighborhood council saying like I
Right.
don't want affordable housing, and so it's all these different
Mm-hmm.
ways of regulatory capture, right? And so part of me is like I would love to just go buy a $4 million house in Menlo Park, tear that
Mm-hmm.
motherfucker down, and build 12 apartments, you know? But it's impossible
Because the
because the
policies,
way the
right?
system is
Mm-hmm.
set up. Like, I need a community vote, I need all of this. And what I think is the exacerbation of these kind of different groups um, is just
Mm-hmm.
regulatory capture in different ways. I live in Austin. It's really
Mm-hmm.
easy to build in Austin. I think people are much happier in Austin than San Francisco. Anecdotally, I think because they're not so
Mm-hmm.
stressed about housing all the time, right? Like you can look in Menlo Park for a 1,200 square foot home and it's like
Right.
$5 million. Like that's like, and the thing about it too is I can't even buy that and tear it down and
Right.
change it, right? And I think that like we have all of these things, and what I found is like the people in the
Mm-hmm.
long term always win, right? So when we think of historically 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, like eventually the dam,
Mm-hmm.
it will break. And I think we're seeing stuff in San Francisco, like the dam is breaking and all of that, where you're like, oh, you want to blame it on this or that. But I think just systems are in place that are not working. And it's easy to blame it on, I think, political
Mm-hmm.
parties, one or the other. I think that the responsibility
Mm-hmm.
actually falls on
The
both,
the
for
local
sure.
neighborhoods who lives there
Right?
as
But it's
well
like,
as the policymakers. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and either you fix it or
Mm-hmm.
it just gets unlivable, right? But eventually, if the crisis gets big enough, someone's going to fix it, and I want to be part of that solution
Well,
because I
speaking
think
of
there's a huge opportunity there,
opportunities, what do you
right?
see as kind of the most exciting opportunity for your organization to tackle? Maybe more specifically, or even based on region.
Uh, so I guess like when it comes to housing, my big
Mm-hmm.
thesis is people want to live in cities, right? So I believe that people want to live in cities. And neighborhoods now are more interesting than square footage
Mm-hmm.
or backyards or any of that. So I think of like how we look at housing instead of like, maybe our parents' dream of the house with the white picket fence. I personally think, hey, nice multifamily with lots of amenities,
Mm-hmm.
a lot more people want that. Like personally, I live in a multifamily space. I love it. We have everything we need on site. It feels really safe. If I leave for a week on a trip, my partner feels much safer there because she's surrounded by
Mm-hmm.
people rather than out in the middle of nowhere where like every noise is like,
Yeah.
holy shit, I watched a scary movie and there's a serial killer outside. Right? And what I think is there's this mass migration happening to cities. And so I think there's going to be a huge
Hmm.
shift with how people live in cities and urbanization. And I think the more we shift to multifamily and we can make it really
Hmm.
nice, I think it's just better. I think one,
Hmm.
it's way more sustainable, right? Like it's a much better use
Hmm.
of land. And two, it allows better talent density and all these different things. So like that's the thesis. I think over the next 20, 30 years, like people don't want to live in rural areas anymore. So it's going to change the landscape. So what I think is like the vision of the future that I believe is in 10 to 15 years, a lot more multifamily units that are
Hmm.
very nice, that people want to live in. They're more community based. They have more amenities. That's the wave that one, I want to support because I
Hmm.
think it makes better access to housing, but two, huge opportunity to make money. And so, like, the technology I'm looking at is how do we make that easier and what I think will also become more competitive. Because,
Hmm.
as, like, for instance, in Austin, more housing comes in line. On the property management side, the ability to rent those
Yeah,
out becomes more
absolutely. And you
competitive.
mentioned helping make this an easier goal, right, over time. What are some of the challenges that you think developers and, other real estate organizations are going to need to overcome to actualize this?
Yeah, I think the hard thing is right now it's a lot easier, and this is a broad way to say it, for bigger companies and
Hmm.
bigger developers to build multifamily. What I think that I would like to see is more smaller contractors and stuff like that getting in the space. And how do we, instead of building just single family homes, how do we build, multiplexes, duplexes, fourplexes, like those type of things? Like, how do we reimagine how housing looks? And how do we also build for
Hmm.
what will be more renters? I think a long term, like people are going to build more renters. I think the one thing about building for renters that's hard is how do we build um, different types of safety nets or those type of things? Because I think, yeah, it's easier to get into a rental property, but you also don't
Hmm.
have the same equity. And so I think that that's one of the problems. I think for a long time, previous generations,
Hmm.
they saved up, they bought a home, which, I mean, if you look at homes in San Francisco 40
Hmm.
years ago, they were very,
Right.
very affordable, right? Now it's like through the roof. One of the things that I think I would say if there was a big policy thing that I think someday will change is how do you limit private equity from just owning
Right.
80,000 homes? And I think that that's something that I
Hmm.
don't know the answer to, but I think the thing is when you can, like, right now it's like, you know,
Hmm.
interest rates are really high for me,
Hmm.
they're really high for you. They're not as high for Blackstone, right? Like they're playing with a different capital pool. They have a different repayment timeline.
Right.
They're like borrowing from themselves. Like they're playing a different game than we are, and they can buy in bulk. They have way bigger pricing power. I think that's something that eventually policymakers will have to deal with because when you have renters
Hmm.
and there's a shock to the system and people are maybe month to month, what do you do with that offset? Because I think policymakers, their first responsibility is to their citizens, right? Even though
Hmm.
like I am a money guy and like I want more power because I think we all do. I think we have to do it in a way where it's like, hey, they shouldn't answer to
Hmm.
me first and a citizen after. And so I think the thing is, if we can build better citizen power, I think that money goes up. And if you look historically at economies that have done real well and created huge amounts of wealth, it's always been
Right.
when there's been a rising middle class, always. And so I think that that's something that we're going to have to think about. Where it's like if you look at the
Hmm.
percentage of adult renters today as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it's radically changing. And what does that do over the next 10, 15 years? I don't know, but I think that's where
That's
the
actually
opportunity sits.
an excellent point, which brings me to my next question for you. I really am curious your take. You're touching on more adult renters, right? So let's talk a little bit about demographic shifts, right? So, each generation's aging, right, and housing mindsets, like what do you see that's driving urban versus suburban development today? You mentioned that you think a lot of people really prefer to live in cities. There's been a lot of literature out there of the work from home environment, right? More people are working from home than ever before, and that allows people to move farther away. But you think that they're wanting to kind of come back into the city, or I'm curious your take on both.
Yeah, dude, I don't buy that shit at all. I think young people want to fucking party and hang out with their friends, and fucking go to clubs and do all of that shit. I think on average, 18 to
Mm-hmm.
35-year-olds are super social and they want to go to where the life is. Like people go to Ibiza because it's where
Yep.
the party is, right? And it's like if you drive around Austin, you see all these young
Mm-hmm.
people, they're out having a ton of fun. It doesn't mean there aren't outliers, but by and large, I think access to media, access to social media, access to all of these things, one people, oh, it's
Mm-hmm.
polarizing, but it also shows you what's out there. And so it's like all these people are like, man, I want to be in Austin. I want to be in San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco. Like this is where the action is, right? And so I think now that more and more and more people see it, that's where the action is. It's
Mm-hmm.
also where the opportunity is. It's where the good jobs are, right? It's where that kind of wealth growth and social growth is. When I worked overseas, in Africa, you saw it really, really starkly because the difference between the rural and the
Mm-hmm.
city was just
Right.
magnitudes of order bigger, right? And I think it's the same thing you're starting to see here, where, man, you're seeing a lot of different corporates where they can't find people to fill
Mm-hmm.
jobs in certain geographies because people are just, they don't want to live there anymore. And it doesn't matter how cheap it is. And I think even in New York, there was a thing where everyone's leaving and then the pandemic ends and everyone's coming back. And like, I think, you'll see it. I read all the time where like, when we chose Austin, a lot of our friends here say, "Oh, I just saw this
Oh yeah.
article, everyone's leaving Austin." I'm like, not Elon. Elon's coming, right? Like, what I'm trying to say is like, I think over time there's going to be small shifts up and down on a month to month or year to year basis, but we're thinking 5, 10, 15 years. I just think cities are better places to
Absolutely. And you
be.
think that, the trend is going to continue where you're going to see more and more adult renters versus homeowners kind of as we go forward.
Yeah, and I don't know
Mm-hmm.
whether that's by choice or just by necessity. I think what's happened is there's so many people that have accrued wealth and have access to resources and access to loans that it allows them to buy property or
Mm-hmm.
multi-property and all those things on leverage. I think there's a whole bracket of people that don't have the
Mm-hmm.
ability to buy that on leverage, right? And so I think we're seeing a kind of
Mm-hmm.
separation of different communities. Where I think you can offset that
Mm-hmm.
is by making it easier to build, right? So like I think Austin's a great example. You see a lot of homes that if you were to drive by four
Mm-hmm.
years ago, probably one house, and now you see four houses on that lot,
Mm-hmm.
and they're significantly cheaper, right? And so like my whole thing is like I think if you allow the free market to work, it does, right? I think places like Boston, San Francisco, LA,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways they just don't, right? Because like I
Right.
need permission from the city council, but the city council doesn't want to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't want to let people in and stuff like that. And so I think that there's a lot of those things that are like regulatory capture, and I think that um, I can understand why people do it, but I think in the long run, like the people always win. Like
Mm-hmm.
eventually it'll shift or it'll die, And so I think in Austin for one, I think one, it's overbuilt now. I don't think it's
Mm-hmm.
overbuilt for 5 or 10 years from now. But I like the fact that like, yo, I could buy that house
Right.
down, tear it down, and develop whatever I want. Right. And I think that allows for a huge amount of
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. Right. And so I think that, some places will and some places won't. I think sometimes people are really lucky and it's very hard to build it in. But I heard somewhere, I don't know if this is true, but like 30% of New York apartments are
Mm-hmm.
like second or third homes. That's why when you walk around at night, there's
Right.
so many
Or
lights
they're
that
owned
are
by
on,
someone that, yeah, they could
right?
be somewhere else in the country or even out of the country, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think over time, I don't know the answer, and I'm not presenting an answer. Like the answer that I think is like, hey, let people buy property and develop it how they want, right? Like if I own the property and I want to put multifamily there, like I should. Like just because you own like I think in broader sense, I think it's something that policymakers are going to have to grapple with. I don't know how they're going to grapple with, but somewhere in there, eventually, I think it will come to a head. And you saw, I think, even recently, Biden mentioned he's going to cap rents, and I don't think that's the way either. But I think once it enters that national conversation, if it's not a big area of friction, it's
Right.
not going to enter that piece of conversation. Once it does, I think the likelihood of something changing within the next 5 or 10 years is
It
almost
makes a lot of
100%.
sense. We're having a big shift also with, the baby boomers to the next generation in the next like 5 to 10 years, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think to me, like I said, my thesis and how I choose to see the world is, hey, I think there's going to be mass urbanization, and people are going to have to be more creative. If I can find technology to help enable that shift, I think inherently it's where the fast moving water is, it's where the tailwinds are, and like it's going to increase the success just based
So
on the
I'd
market
love to
growth.
know right now, what are some projects that you're working on that you're most excited about? You mentioned finding the right technology. Is there anything more you can share with us about what's
Yeah.
exciting you today?
I mean, yeah, so a lot of the stuff we look at, I would say like our sweet spot, when we look at the fund, we kind of break it down into
Mm-hmm.
three core kind of themes. Is does it help you build things, move things, or make things? And so a lot of times we say that's loosely
Mm-hmm.
construction, supply chain, and manufacturing. But the thesis is, does it help us build things, move things, make things, or
Mm-hmm.
optimize any of those, right? And so that could be housing. To me, a lot of housing is all three, right? So when you think of tilt up, manufactured housing, that's building things. That's also moving things because
Mm-hmm.
how do you get it there? Are you building it on site? Or are you building it in a shop and transferring it? And then how are you manufacturing it, right? So it's like I kind of look at that all as an interconnected space. The stuff that I think I'm most excited about is how do we make the multifamily life cycle experience
Mm-hmm.
easier and more efficient, right? And that could be from the leasing side, which we have an investment in. And I hate to pitch my book. We have an investment called Refi. It's amazing for property managers. It's fantastic. There's another one that we're really excited about. We're looking at right now. It's called Range, and it's the project management. And so a lot of it is it enabling and accelerating that life cycle. I think because of
Mm-hmm.
AI and data structuring, there's a lot of opportunities that have arisen in the last 12 months that previously were just
Right.
impossible to do, right? And so now it's like, how do we kind of capture that and harness
Mm-hmm.
that energy? And so to me, it's all based on that same thing. Like, how do we harness the energy for what I say is the growing
Mm-hmm.
acceleration of urbanization? And I think if you go around anecdotally and you talk to young kids who are even in college, anywhere, almost all of them after graduation
Mm-hmm.
want to move to their local big city. You know, you'll rarely
Right.
hear someone be like, "Oh, I'm going to go back home." Like they'll be like, "I want to go here. I want to go there. I want to go to this." And what I think is like, hey, instead of trying to squeeze out margin, like how can I have
Mm-hmm.
smaller margin with
That
stickier
well, where do
revenue?
you see like entrepreneurs, VCs? Where do you see them poking around for some untapped opportunities? You mentioned AI, right? Any other suggestions?
Yeah. I mean, shit, dude. I should ask you if I knew, man. I mean, like I feel like my life is quite literally
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to finding that. I'm always like trying to find hey, where are the interesting people. Um, I think the hard thing about that is I think yeah, AI or stuff, but a lot of times it's so hard to predict because you'll just run into
Mm-hmm.
somebody and they just see the world different. And so, speaking of books, there's a great book that just came out this week actually. I bought it first day out called Pattern Breakers by Mike Maples from Floodgate, a really famous seed investor. And what he says is a pattern breaker is someone that
Mm-hmm.
traditionally comes from a little bit outside of an orthodoxy that looks at it completely different. And so they're playing by a different set of rules and reimagining what that looks like. And so a lot of like my job in day to day is to try and be as kind of loud with a flag and a siren, because it's very hard for me to look for them. Sometimes it's easier for me to be really loud and allow them to find me and saying like, hey, I'm interested. How can I get connected? How can I do this? Because there's just so many, I think, one, super amazing, smart, bright people. Like, fuck, you throw a rock in any direction, you're going to hit somebody smart. And it's like, how can I build a filter where I can attract them? It's almost like, I think if you're like bear hunting, a lot of times you go, you lay the trap, right? And then they come to you. And so it's kind of the same thing. Like, I'm trying to figure out a way to get out there and say, hey, I believe in this thesis. I believe in this vision of the future, and be as loud and as open about that. And then have other people be like, hey, that's a future I believe in too. And and I think it'll look like this too. And I go, wow, fuck. That's like crazy. I think it could look like that too. And a lot of times, like, I think it happens almost like serendipity. Like someone comes from an outside sector, maybe they're working in a prop tech and they're bringing knowledge from something totally different. And then they look at the system and you're like, yo, why don't you just
change this or
do this? But because people have been so focused on how it's been done, they don't see that. And there's another research guy who founded a company called Consilient Research named Michael Mauboussin, like super famous finance guy. Like in our world, I guess he's not famous like a celebrity. I don't know if anybody's listening to this going, I don't know who that is. But you should Google him, Michael Mauboussin, and who knows, maybe he'll hear me talking about him. But a lot of times he said the greatest research is from coming from learning about other things. Right. And so a lot of times, like applying things you've learned in different areas to what you're doing now provides a different perspective. And so a lot of times, like, someone, when I say urbanization or doing this, like someone from Hong Kong, maybe like, dude, well, we did that in Hong Kong like this. But I've never been to Hong Kong, so I wouldn't know that. Right. And so I think there's all these different experiences. And my goal is to, hey, how can I get out there and try to attract these people and then do my best when they come to allow me to invest in them. Be like,
I love that.
Man, like you should take my money and allow me to kind of join you on the ride. And so I think sometimes going back to Refi, it's founded by a young woman named Connie. All the time, I'm like, man, like this is just great. I think she's so brilliant and so smart, and getting to work with these people who I'm like, yo, man, like you guys are just killers, like it's just the way you look at the world, I think is so brilliant. And so like kind of like a coach, my goal is like, hey, I may never be able to play as good as you, but maybe I can add a little value by seeing the court in ways you do.
That's super exciting.
Right.
Well,
it is, dude. I honestly think I have like the best job in the world.
That.
Right? Even my office, I have my poster of Good Morning Vietnam. It's my favorite movie. I'm like, man, I came in the other day, someone walked by, like, I don't know what you do. Are you like an advertising agency? Like, you guys look like you're having so much fun. I'm like,
you should have fun though, right? Like, that's super important.
Like,
yeah.
We do have a lot of fun. Yeah. I think because we get to live in this world where we're trying to think of like, what does the future look like? And so I think it's like, one, it's super fortunate. Like I'm so lucky when I think of where I sit in the world. Like I'm just super, super blessed. But it's great because I think we're natural optimists. And so we're always thinking, hey, what do we think it could look like? What could it look like? How do we get there? And like, and so I think sometimes like, sometimes I'll have a bad day. And like, if I talk to like people I've grown up with, or maybe like some friends who are still in prison, and I'm like, man, what am I complaining about? Like, I need to just shut the fuck up because like, I have it so good, dude. I
love to hear that. Well, we've been talking a lot about predicting the future. So to wrap up our crystal ball section of our podcast, if you will, you really hit on that you firmly believe in a continued urbanization or re-urbanization, right? Going forward, maybe 10 to 20 years from now. I'm very curious, do you see that happening, nationally? Do you see some more like Sun Belt areas? Do you see it continuing to be an issue for cities that you mentioned, like Boston or San Francisco? How do you see it playing out regionally?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think the one thing that COVID and stuff did is I think it opened up more
Hmm.
areas like a Florida or a Texas or other places that kind of had a little inkling of growth, and now I think there was an explosion. But because it happened, it kind of built that almost
Hmm.
that initial kind of catalyst. Um, I think I see a lot more of that. I think the way that state taxes
Hmm.
and taxation is managed from a government perspective is probably become more, um, I think,
Hmm.
prominent with young founders. I think there's a lot of people like San Francisco, even now by volume,
Hmm.
is still a huge magnet. I think people like what I think is once people had some money, they buy a home,
Hmm.
they have a kid, they're kind of anchored there. I think what COVID did in some sense, it loosened a few of the anchors. And so I think like as more companies relocate to a Texas or a Florida or a certain place like
Hmm.
Tennessee that maybe have better taxation structures, I think that's going to be
Hmm.
more difficult to jar loose. And I think like some places like New York, I don't know if they're ever going to be replaced. I think in other places, I think there's going to be a big shift. Not maybe as big like
Hmm.
it's radical like San Francisco's going to die. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I do think that being able to build cheaper in a place like Texas, I think is a strategic advantage, right? Like it's just
Hmm.
better financial sense. And so like I think if you can like add an extra 10% of your income compounded over 20 years, like that's
Hmm.
huge, right? And so I think what happened is people now have experienced that. And so I've met so many people, myself among them, that are like, hey, I'm doing so much in Zoom, but I still want to be in a place,
Right.
what I say is like where the action is. And so like I think now in places like Austin and Miami, or you're hearing like there's such a
Hmm.
density of people that move there, even like the Citadel or like Goldman's moving more people. I think once that density's there, you'll see a different type of urbanization migration. Will it stick over the next 5, 10 years?
Hmm.
I hope so, because I think it makes life a little bit easier. Like if I make an extra 10% of income for doing the
Right.
same thing, or 15%, or it makes my life easier to one, build a better base, which gives me, I think,
Hmm.
additional optionality, which makes things easier for my children or my friends' children, all of that. So I think we're gonna see more of that. I think like we mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
like X, right? Twitter just is gonna move to Austin. Like
Yeah, that
that's
just came
big. That's
out.
a big company. And then you've seen yeah, you saw Citadel go from Chicago to Florida. You've seen Canyon Partners, another big hedge fund that went from LA to Dallas. Like, I think that, you know, people are going to do that more and more because before, like, the ability to find
Hmm.
talent to hire, I think was very difficult. And now I think that's kind of fluctuating. Do I see it happening major overnight? Probably not. But there's an amazing company in
Hmm.
Austin called Base Power Company. They just raised a really big Series A. I think great company, really embedded in Austin. If they exit in 5 years for a few $1 billion and all those people anchor and have
Hmm.
kids, like, and Twitter gets here, that I think that will
Yeah,
grow at an
absolutely.
exponential rate.
Well, given all of your background and expertise, obviously on all the topics we were just chatting about, I'm sure our listeners are curious about a few answers to some rapid fire questions. Can I throw a few your way, Daniel? All right.
Let's do
So,
it. Yeah.
if you were given $50 million today, you have to invest it immediately. Go to asset, location, give us some details. What would you be doing?
Shit, man. It's so. Well, I'll give you two answers. The first is, if you're giving me 50 miles, I'd probably just put it in government
I know.
T-bills, right? Because rates are so high. Man, I get 5% right now. It's $2.5 million a year, right? It's like risk free. Other stuff. that I think for me, I kind of look
Mm-hmm.
at investment as like portfolio management. So like I work in VC, and that's where like I'm building it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably be heavy overweight VC. But I think I'd probably cash flow it
Mm-hmm.
out. So I'd probably put it in multifamily, right? Like to me, I love multifamily. I think it's probably my favorite. I think office is a fucking disaster. Um, which I hate to say I think is fair. I think people paying the same amount of money for office as like an apartment is fucking crazy. And how it ever got there is just bananas. Like sometimes when I look for office and they're like, oh, it's this much a square foot. I'm like, dude, you're fucking on drugs. Like there's absolutely no way. And I know a lot of people like to take cheap shots at Adam Neumann and stuff like that, but like that dude radically transformed how we
Mm-hmm.
look at office spaces. And like even when I came to Austin and I was looking at like the cost of some of these plates,
Mm-hmm.
it was fucking crazy. I'm like, yo, I'll bet you $10,000 you're not going to rent that in the next 5 years. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't make sense. Like the world that
Mm-hmm.
way, I think has changed. Right? And I think that's a really, 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 really good change. Like if I'm paying that much, I should be able to live in that
I
motherfucker.
love that.
Right? Okay. So I think that like right now the best opportunity that I think and always I'll probably always say multifamily because people are always gonna need a place to live. And I think if you
Mm-hmm.
can rent and build apartments that are affordable and provide good service, you will always have
Makes sense. Yeah.
tenants, right? But you got to put in the work. This thing about like people talk shit on Walmart, but like if you go return someone to Walmart,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to treat you well. It doesn't matter who you are. They're going to treat you with respect,
Mm-hmm.
treat you good, and give you good customer service. And so it's like Walmart didn't become the biggest company by poor service. And so I think that there's that same opportunity, and that's where I put most of my money, other
No, that
than
makes a lot of
VC because
sense.
that's
Would
my
your
real lane.
multifamily be in Austin?
I like Austin, man. I'm pretty sold in Austin. I think
Mm-hmm.
multifamily probably anywhere if it's done well can be renting. It's like I think the places that most people want to do multifamily is places like Boston. 'Cause it's so fucking hard to build. So you're charging like 8,000 for a fucking outhouse, right? It's crazy. Um, I just think that a lot of times the stuff that goes with that, I don't. I lived in Boston for a few years. I think it's hard to get around. It's not a place where I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's a very livable city. I think the thing about Austin is it kind of reminds me like San Francisco. Sure, there's problem, but it's also very livable. There's lots of good food. There's
There's
lots of this.
action.
Like, um, but I
Yeah.
think anywhere, yeah, there's action. Like I think anywhere. Like I think if you provide good homes at a good price,
Love
you're always
that.
gonna have renters. You know, I also am a big fan of Bentonville, Arkansas. I'm a big fan of Cincinnati,
Nice.
Ohio. I'm a big fan of Missouri and all those different places. I think that like it
Sure.
doesn't always have to be the biggest city, but it's like people want to go where the action is. And I think like if you do these apartments where it's like, man, they're so luxury. Like sometimes when I look at like apartments and I remember what it was like 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
like these apartments are beautiful. Like the appliances are beautiful. Like I'm like, wow, this is so nice. Like the quality of living has
Mm-hmm.
improved so much. Right? I'm like, this is great. And I think if we can create a community where like people have that and they're not so worried about housing, I think just people will be
Oh,
nicer. I think the
absolutely.
world will be better.
How about your favorite tool or software that you use on the job day to day?
Oh, dude, my favorite tool, I think the software that I'm in the most, um, is probably audio. It's our
Nice.
CRM. And so like that, so it's ATTIO. It's what we call our source of truth. So like if it's not in the audio,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't exist. And so I think like to me what I think is so much of life is just based on relationships and like putting extra effort in to support your community and people I think is like the biggest alpha. So like I'm always trying to
Mm-hmm.
keep in touch with people and be what I'd say is a trusted source that way and like do my best. Like, how do I provide value and how do I give first? I think a lot of people are very extractive, where it's like, what can you do for me? And I try to approach every single relationship I get into, like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, what can I do for you? Because if I'm always like, I think adding value to the people around me, then they'll always pick up my phone
Mm-hmm.
calls is what I hope. And so like I try to approach everything with like, hey, when I meet you, like how can I help you? How can I help you? How can I help you? And recently I had a friend who lost his job and they downsized and he was talking like I need to do anything. I'm like, dude, do you volunteer? And he's like, no.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, dude, go volunteer. Right? Like I think because like if you do something nice
Right.
for someone else, it'll put you in a good mood. And I think one of the bad things about social media is it's very me focused. And I try to be like very
Mm-hmm.
we focused, right? And so I think audio for me, like I try to take notes on all sorts of things. So when I check in with someone, I can be like, hey, like, you just got married last year, you had this, how's that going? And so it's like I try to do that. And so
I
that's
love
kind of where
that. That's
I spend a
excellent
lot of
advice. You're
time.
building a real relationship, right? When you are keeping tabs on. Yeah.
I'm trying to. That's the goal, right? I think again it goes back to most people just don't like I think if you put in 5% extra work, that's like more than 98% of people every day.
Well, what would you say is the most common misconception about the work that you're doing? I'm sure there's quite a few, but
Oh man. I think in VC the way I see the world is just because you're doing it today doesn't mean you can do it in 15 years. And so I think there's such a long tail on these investments, sometimes 10 or 15 years, that I think a lot of people they're so early and so transactional. Um, but I'm trying to do it, and I'm going to quote one of my mentors and this guy I really look up to named Rahul Moodgal,
hmm
based in London. Like this is a game of
hmm
duration, right? And so like everything I do every single day is with the focus on being here in 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Like even me being healthy and like going to the gym later, I'm doing it because I
right.
want to be able to do this when I'm 75 or 85. So I'm like, "Okay, I need to take care of
hmm
myself if I want to have the energy, you know? And so a lot of that, I think sometimes people are like, oh, this isn't working or it's too hard or this or that. And again, from the very top of this conversation, like think about it
hmm
in 10 or 20 or 30 years. And so like another thing I heard one time I actually listened to another podcast is like I want to be
hmm
like your favorite sports team, right? I want you to like love my vision and I want you to believe in it. In some seasons I'm probably not going to do well. Like I'm probably going to make some bad investments and I'm going to lose some games, but I want you to believe in the
hmm
overall vision and support the team and say, hey, you had a bad season, it's okay, but I believe in the long-term vision. I believe in it. It's like your favorite team. Sometimes they lose, sometimes they win, but you
I
love them
love
and
that.
you're
Well, I'm
they're your
from
team.
Chicago originally, so I know how that is with the Cubbies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Man, yeah.
wrapping this up, what advice would you give to somebody looking to break into the venture capital space, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds?
I mean, the first thing that I would say is like what I said, like, and this is like high level
hmm
breakdown is go to where the action is. Meaning, like, I think geography and proximity to things
hmm
happening is so valuable. And if you want to be in the
hmm
movie industry, you move to LA. If you want to be in the VC space or something like that, go to San Francisco, go to Austin, go to Boston, go to New York. Like, figure out a way to become part of that community, and then from there, figure out a
hmm
way how to add value. Um, is it easy? Absolutely not. Right? Is it possible? Totally. Right? Because I think most people don't want to add value.
hmm
They're like, hey, I want you to do it for me. Um, But I think like if you really want to be in VC and you're living in Wyoming,
Right.
it's going to be really hard. The same way like if you want to be in the movies and you live
hmm
in Wyoming, it's really hard. And so like to me, hey, how can you go to the water cooler? Like where are these people hanging out? How can I get to know them? And then I think also like try and find a mentor. I think the hard thing is a lot of times people try to find like
hmm
the most famous person as their mentor, right? Like and I've never had that work. Find someone
hmm
that just they're 2 steps ahead of you. Find someone that 1 step ahead of you. Someone that cares about you, right? And then you eventually what happens, I
Mm-hmm.
think, is mentors just become friends, right? Then you find a new mentor, and a mentor becomes a friend. But I think people undervalue the power of mentorship, and I think they do that sometimes. Is they're like, I knew someone one time where she's like, I need a mentor. I want Ray Dalio to mentor me, and I'm like, it's a pretty big ask. You know what I mean? Like he
Right.
mentors like Zuckerberg, you know, but like who's a few
Mm-hmm.
steps ahead of you, right? And then who knows? Maybe in 5 or 10 years or 15, maybe Dalio does. I don't know, but maybe things will change. The people that have been the most helpful in my life um, have not always been the most famous. Now I do have some famous mentors, and I'm so fucking grateful for that. But it's like I have just as many people. Like I just got asked to if I'd be interested in joining a very big board, one of the biggest nonprofits in the U.S. And I asked a mentor of mine. This was the first person I asked. They said, "Well, it's not really
Mm-hmm.
up the lane of what I'm doing. Do you think it would be valuable for me?" Before I even responded to the email, and he said, "Yeah." And I've gotten so much value out of
Mm-hmm.
this person. He's nobody famous, and he's nobody like you. And be like, oh wow. But what I know is that he actually cares about how I do in life. And so I think finding those people that are not within your
Mm-hmm.
family and not within your community, it's like sometimes you know how you can have more honest
Yes.
conversations with someone you met at a
Right.
bar because they don't know you. Like you don't have any pretenses. Like you could show up like, oh, I'm a fucking mess. And they're like, okay. Whereas like, you talk to your parents like, yeah, everything's good. I'm fine. you know? And so I think the thing is hey, go to where the action is and then find somebody that's a little bit further than you and say, hey, I have a question. Can you teach me? Hey, I have this. Can you teach me? And over time, that will grow. And I think build the process and don't worry about the outcome. Like, will I ever be one of the biggest venture capital? Well, I don't know. Would I like to be? Of course. But I'll tell you what, I have a ton
I
of fun
love
in the
that.
office every day. You know?
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights. I know you're super busy, so we really appreciate you spending the time to sit down and chat with us. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people from this podcast that would love to find you online. So, where can they get in touch with you?
I mean, the easiest way is on LinkedIn. Just add me or shoot me an email at Daniel at
Awesome. Well,
rockyardventures.com.
Daniel, again, thank you. And thank you to
Yeah.
everyone who tuned in today. If you enjoyed this episode, do not miss out on the next one. Visit crexi.com/podcast and sign up to get the next episode delivered straight to your inbox. And of course, you can subscribe to the Crexi Podcast on your favorite podcast app and check out our YouTube channel for video recordings of each episode. Take care and be sure to tune in next time.